Welcome to the System to Success show. On this show, we'll cover the best growth advice from top CEOs in North America and beyond. On each episode, your host, Jay Crutchfield, he's a former software engineer turned entrepreneur, created and maintained online marketing, online sales, and fulfillment systems for global brands. He offers non-traditional wisdom about business systems mastery, while his guests share the story of how they built their companies. Jay and his guests talk entrepreneurship, digital marketing, strategy, and business principles. But they also talk about what it means to be human with all the ups and downs, advances, and setbacks. And what he does is he takes his information and strategies that has helped catapult global brands and brings that to the small business owner to give them that advantage. Make sure to subscribe and follow for more of these business system mastery principles. Hey everybody, welcome to the show. I'm Jay Crutchfield, your host, and I'm so excited today. We have a very special guest in the place today. We have Miss Lenora Billings-Harris. Lenora is a consultant, international speaker, and author of The Diversity Advantage, a guide to making diversity work. She was named by Diversity Women magazine as one of the 20 top influential diversity leaders in the U.S. She's a certified speaking professional and the former president of the National Speakers Association. Without any further ado, let's welcome to the stage Lenora. Welcome, Lenora.
Thank you so much. My pleasure to be with you today.
Yes, definitely excited to speak with you. I know you have so much to share with the audience, so let's get started today. Okay, so Lenora, can you share a little bit more about your background so the audience can get to know you a little bit better?
Sure. So to go all the way back, but trust me, it won't be a long story, but I really started out as a high school teacher. And then when I happened to move from Virginia to Michigan, it was harder to get a position because I was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is where the University of Michigan is. So they have a great program. I couldn't get in easily or quickly as a teacher. And so I took a pivot in my career and discovered adult learning. So I started working for what is now the Executive Development Center at University of Michigan. And that's when I fell in love with working with adults who wanted to learn how to deliver, how to do their jobs better, and particularly how to be better leaders. So that's when I then got an advanced degree in adult education with an emphasis on business. So continued to work for University of Michigan for a while until General Motors stole me away. And I started working for GM. And my job was to deliver management development programs to sales service parts managers and dealer principals across North America. Now, this was in the 70s. So I didn't realize that was when I was really cutting my teeth in the area of diversity and inclusion. It was a fabulous experience, though. And ultimately, my husband and I moved around quite a bit. And in 1986 is when I decided to start my own firm and didn't know about the whole profession of speaking. I just knew about training. And so I started my business. My initial clients were all in the automotive area. So I was a subcontractor to other firms that needed additional trainers, or a subcontractor for the automotive manufacturers themselves. And then finally discovered the National Speakers Association. So Jay shared with you that I'm a past president, so I am very prejudiced toward that organization because everything I know about this business and any successes I have had, I really accredit it to what I have learned from my colleagues at National Speakers Association. But in any case, I discovered them 2 years after I started my business, and that's when I really realized that this is a profession that's connected to the meeting industry. And it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And that's when I realized, oh, okay, there's much for me to learn and many new things I needed to learn as an independent consultant that is separate from corporations.
Wow. So you're actually from Virginia. Huh.
Well, no, I'm actually from New Jersey.
Oh, okay.
Like I said, I moved around a lot. So I'm from New Jersey,
Okay.
but I went to school. I went to college in Virginia, Hampton Institute, which is
Oh,
now
wow.
Hampton University.
Hmm.
And then I moved to Michigan. That's where my husband was already. And so then I went to University of Michigan. And then we moved from there to Philadelphia, and then from there to Phoenix. And Phoenix is where NSA, National Speakers Association, is headquartered. So that's how I eventually discovered that they were there. So traveling and living in different places has always been part of my business. And then the last piece relative to my background is when you start out as a new speaker, you're looking for, what lane should you be in? What should your topic be? And a lot of times new speakers don't want to speak to the audiences that come from their work background. So, for instance, nurses who are now speakers don't want to talk to nurses, or managers or leaders don't want to talk to the corporate environment, which is a big mistake because that's who you know and that's where your expertise is. And so I was thinking I was just going to be a trainer and continue to do leadership training in one way or another, or hiring and firing and all of those kind of things. And I did do that in automotive, but what I learned from my more experienced colleagues was that I either needed to specialize in a topic or specialize in an industry. So since I didn't want to necessarily specialize in an industry, which would have probably been automotive, I was looking for what would that topic be. And after a life-changing experience in South Africa in the early 90s, I got clear in knowing that my purpose on the planet was to do diversity and inclusion work. And that started my development of building my knowledge and experience put together to have more of an expertise in diversity, inclusion, and now unconscious bias.
Wow. So with the guidance from some experienced individuals, you decided like, okay, they have some experience. Let me listen to what they're saying. They said I should specialize in either an industry or just a topic specifically. And so you focus on diversity and inclusion. And you speak about the influential impact of some time in the 90s in South Africa. Now, I've seen some footage from, I believe, one of your talks about the power of belonging. And so is that part of
Mhm.
that transformational period?
That is actually that clip that's now on my website was one of the first times that I told the complete story.
Hmm.
And so it's a clip for those of you watching this now. It's a very short clip. It's only about 6 minutes. And at the beginning of it, I start the story. Then I do a bit of teaching around belonging in the middle, and then and unconscious bias, and then I close it with the rest of the story, so to speak. So to your question, yes, it was I had started going to South Africa in 1991, right after Mandela was freed from prison. And I was doing all kinds of training and development and keynote speaking there. I usually would go for 3 weeks at a time, a couple of times a year. And then in 1994, I'm not going to tell the whole story because I'd like your speakers to go to the site and just
Yes.
see it because they'll get the full impact of it. But nevertheless, when I was there in March of 1994, which was a month before he became president, that was also the time when I really was searching on what should my area of expertise be. And I kept moving away from diversity. Everybody else was telling me, my friends and colleagues, oh, you should do diversity work. But they told me when I would say, why should I do that? They would say, well, you're Black and female and you should do it. And, because it's a hot topic. And I'm thinking that is so not the right reason to pick a topic. And I didn't like what I saw other people doing at the time. It was very judgmental. Now it's changed a great deal since then. But nevertheless, so I was on this search, and then I go to South Africa the month before Nelson Mandela becomes president, and something happened to me in a training session, and I realized that I needed to do this work, and I needed to find my own voice in doing this work in the space of diversity and inclusion in a way that would fit my personality, my values, and frankly, my beliefs about how people can understand and value differences in a way that could make them more impactful and effective in their work and in their communities.
Hmm. Wow. So I won't spoil it for the folks. So I'll definitely make sure that I'll provide a link directly to your site in that video too. One point that one snippet that I did want to talk about too on that side of that power of belonging, you mentioned one of the top um, characteristics or things that humans desire is belonging. And so looking at that and thinking about just that desire as a human being of belonging, how did you find your place of belonging as a speaker, transitioning from trainer to speaker?
Well, it's interesting that when I talk to people who started as trainers and moved to speaking, and talk to people who started keynote speaking and now want to deliver training, I find that my position as a trainer first and then a speaker is the more advantageous. Now, of course, you could go in either direction, but as a trainer, it was no problem for me to be in front of a group for half a day, a full day. Years ago, my programs used to be 2 days long, and so I had plenty of material. Then, when I wanted to develop a keynote, the issue was, what are the most important points that I can deliver in 45 minutes to 60 minutes? So it's easier to have a lot of content that you can narrow down than to have a little bit of content, and how do you make it into a bigger program? So I'm fortunate that I have that background. When I was primarily delivering training and development, training workshops and seminars and that kind of thing, I often wondered, how can I talk about this particular topic of diversity and inclusion in a way that would be effective as a keynoter? Because keynoting is education and entertainment. And you really have to think about inserting humor and changing your pace. And you're doing most of the talking, unlike in a training session where you can pose a question and then put them in small groups and all of that. And these days, people want even keynoters to have some interaction in there, but it's still in a small period of time. So I really had to think through, how could I do this on such a sensitive topic where people need to get comfortable? They need to feel like they belong, as meaning in this case, that I'm not going to be blaming and shaming and making them feel bad. So I was out jogging one day. In fact, I was at a winter workshop for NSA at the time in Norfolk, Virginia. I remember the day very clearly. So I was out early in the morning jogging, and it occurred to me during the jog that a story that I used to close my workshops laid a perfect foundation for a keynote. And so that grew into my most popular keynote, which is based on Wizard of Oz characters. And so I thought, well, let me take the Wizard of Oz characters and make those metaphors for each of the concepts that I teach in diversity and inclusion. So for many, many years, that has been my most popular keynote because it's fun, especially in the US or in North America. It's fun, it's non-threatening, and people come in wondering, what on earth does this have to do with diversity? Which to me is so clear, because they are a diverse team. And so that's what I talk about.
Wow. So you go at a definitely a relatable, creative way to tell the story and talk about diversity and inclusion. So on that topic, you speak about you don't come off with the the blaming and the shaming. So how do you? I guess the question I'm thinking about on that side is, how do you make sure that you're focusing and doing the inclusion of the folks without the blaming and the shaming, but also educating at the same
Yes.
time?
So from a keynote perspective, because people, when they hear speaking, they usually are thinking of keynoting, although speaking is speaking, training, consulting, writing books, any way that you use the spoken word. Remember, I'd said earlier that I had really rejected this because I didn't like what I had seen other people doing way back in the 90s. I truly believe adults learn best when they're having a good time. And so way before I learned about neuroscience and learned about the importance of belonging and how that impacts so much of what we do in the workplace or in our communities, I had already started thinking about how can I talk about this topic in a way that pulls people in instead of pushing them away. And so how National Speakers Association helped, and plus, talking to lots of people and reading books and doing all those things we do to develop our expertise, both our platform skills as well as our topic. One of the things that I recognized was when we are speaking, our audience wants to know we're human beings. They see us up on the platform and think that we are somehow different from them. And one of the ways that you can pull them in is through story. And plus, we learn through story anyway. It's not about all the statistics and that kind of thing. We need the statistics to show that we're legitimate and we know what we're talking about, but people really remember stories. And so my way of talking about diversity and inclusion, different from the blame and shame, is I would show them evidence, the statistics, the research that shows we need to do something different. I would show them that evidence, but it would be more, here's what the research is. Now, what does that mean to us day to day? What are some examples of how that shows up? And now what can we do about it? So for example, I'll give you just a quick example that I use in almost all of my talks. I will have already talked to people or shared with people the research-based evidence of how unconscious bias impacts our decisions. And it's unconscious, it's very unintentional. All of us have bias. Bias is not in and of itself a bad thing. It helps us get through the day. So I kind of teach them talk to them about all of those things. And I will have shared with them research from University of Michigan and University of Maryland and Catalyst and all these places now that have studied organizations that are diverse and inclusive, because just being diverse is not enough. But the evidence that shows companies make more money when they're diverse and inclusive, and they value that diversity of thought. So I've shared that with them. They see what the evidence is. And then I lead into how it shows up in the workplace. And so one example I share is something as simple as a handshake. And typically, if it's a keynote, I bring a volunteer up on the stage with me. And we shake hands the way people would expect us to shake hands. And then I ask, when did you learn this? And you probably learned it when you were 5 or 6. And I say, okay, you're not going to hurt my feelings. Rate my handshake on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being perfect, superb. And usually I'll get a 4. And it's intentional that I don't shake hands the way I normally do. So that is, I have to think about not having too firm of a grip. And I'll ask them, so what could I have done to make it a 5? And almost always they will say a firmer grip, that kind of thing. And we talk about that we give direct eye contact and a firm handshake and stand up if you can, depending on the circumstance. And we learned all of that when we were kids. If we were born in Western culture, that's how we learned how to shake hands. Then I shake the person's hand again, and I intentionally make it a dead fish handshake, really weak, and I don't give them eye contact. And the whole audience will groan when that happens, and you see the changed expression on a person's face. And then we analyze that. Why is it you suppose that we respond that way? Why do you think that? Well, because you're supposed to have a firm handshake. Well, suppose the person hurt their hand, or suppose the person comes from a culture where you don't touch at all, or suppose a person comes from essentially the same culture you do, like North America, but they happen to be Latino or African American. And in African Americans' case, many grow up in the South, learning that you don't give a person in authority direct eye contact. Now, even though today that would not cause you to be hurt or die, back in Jim Crow time and slavery time, you would never, well, first of all, you probably wouldn't shake hands at all, but you would never look a person of authority directly in their eyes, because it would be seen as offensive. So the point is that I give them a positive example. I go into more detail on that whole thing than I just did, but I give them an example of something everybody can relate to, and then I bring it back around to the concept or the principle that I'm trying to teach them. In this case, our unconscious bias is if we shake hands with somebody in the workplace who gives us a weak handshake, we have already written them off. Next, that's not a good leader. We make up all kind of stuff about them when in fact, it was just a handshake. And maybe there was a reason for that handshake. And they could be completely qualified, separate from that handshake, that could be qualified for the job. So then the point I make is, and if the handshake's that important, we can teach people how to shake hands in the environment that we need them to be in. So I constantly bring up examples like that. I will share some personal examples. Now, on my topic, I have to be careful about how many personal examples I share, because I also know that the audience gets so uncomfortable with negative things that they will, the unconscious response and then conscious is to try to make it be something else. So if I use an example of a time that I know I was discriminated against, or I was being stereotyped, the audience doesn't want that to be so. And so then they will sometimes say, oh, you were just having a bad day, or that person was having a bad day. They don't want to own up to what it really is. So as new speakers, many of whom think that all I have to do is get up there and tell my story, not so. You really need to look at your story, find out what the learning points are, and make those relate to the people in your audience. So you don't just tell the story and think they're going to get it. You need to tell your stories, have a point to it, and an action that they can take that relates to their life. So I mix up general stories and examples and my personal stories, and then always, of course, what are the actions to take that people can leave feeling that, okay, I've learned something that didn't just make me feel good or be inspired at the moment, but I could do some things different.
Yes, that makes sense. Making sure that that action items are giving and that you tell the story beforehand. You look at learning points and not just this awesome story. So make sure people have the meaning behind the story and then go take action on it. So that's really good. And you touched on some points that that drove me back to thinking about just some of those times. And I won't touch on it for too long, but just wanted to touch on it just a little bit more about, the experiences as things have shifted over the years. So you've talked about, the time when, African Americans, especially in the South, and some of my family tells me about that, when you couldn't really look somebody in the eye because of, what could happen in consequences. And now just the bias that people have with the handshake and things of that nature. And so how, as a speaker that may have grew up during that time and is wanting to get into the field, that aspiring speaker, how can they transition from, the different things that have happened over the years to make sure that they are included more in just some of the different speaking events and things that go on nowadays?
Well, and I want to make sure I'm understanding the question is how might speakers starting today be influenced by or think about things that might have happened in the past and how that could be incorporated into their presentation?
Yes,
Okay.
that's part. And then and the second part of that is to how do they make sure that they get over those things
Yes,
so that
yes,
when they come into those types of environments that blame and shame doesn't take place?
yes, yes. Well, one of the things that that I hear often at NSA, at our National Speakers Conventions in particular, now not necessarily from the main stage, but just when you're chit-chatting with people, is kind of one of our cardinal rules is never ever use the platform as your therapy. That is, you might have had some bad things happen, and now you want to go and speak about it because you've overcome it, so you think. And, let me get on the platform and tell folks what I did in order to overcome it. That's perfectly fine to do, but make sure you don't do it until you are fully ready to do it. That is, you're somewhat disengaged from it, because otherwise all of your own biases, most of which are unconscious, your own biases will come out, and half the audience that may have been the offender, for something that bad might have happened, they're now shrinking in their seats because you're now making them feel guilty, even though it wasn't them personally. And it could even be something that is very distant, but still people will connect. So, for example, the experience that happened to me in South Africa, which, just so the listeners aren't thinking it was some horrible thing and I almost died and that kind of, it wasn't like that. But I could not tell that story from the platform for many, many years, because I couldn't figure out, well, where would it fit? And it's such a powerful story. I didn't want to tell it from the platform and then lose the audience. So it took really a long time for me to get comfortable with it personally. I knew that is what inspired me to do this work, but it wasn't something that was appropriate from the platform in most cases. And so what happened for me, that experience happened in 1994. I did not tell that story from the platform until 2014. I mean, 2007, when I had the good fortune of being president of the National Speakers Association, and I was in South Africa. Now, I've been there many times, and I had been there many times in between, but this time I was speaking to other speakers in South Africa. And it occurred to me that was the right audience to share my story, because they could relate to it so well. Once I shared it there, not as polished as it is on the clip on my website, but I shared the story and I could feel the release. I knew, okay, now I could share the story. Because part of the problem was when people would ask me why I do this work offline, like not on the platform. So I'm at a dinner with clients or whatever on the night before. If they would ask me, I would tell them. And I could never get through the story without crying. Now, I'm a hugger. I am comfortable with my emotion. I'm not even upset if tears come to my eyes if I'm in a training session or if I'm on the platform. But there are times, where you don't want to have the boo-hoo, as Oprah would call it, the ugly cry. So I knew I couldn't tell the story without getting really emotional. Finally, when I told it in South Africa to my colleagues, I knew that then I could start developing this to determine when and if it's appropriate on the platform. I still don't tell it every time. It depends on who I'm talking to. It depends on what the overall goals and objectives are that I have and my partner client has. I see my partners as clients. I see my clients as partners. It depends on what the overall goals are. But now I can tell the story, get the points out, show emotion in the way it ought to be shown. So back to the question of how do you control when things happen? And things are going to happen off the platform as well as on the platform. They may even happen in the conference where you are, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be diversity related. But what we need to remember as speakers is we are on the moment we leave our home en route to that client engagement. We're on from that moment forward, because we don't know who may also be traveling to that engagement that's going to be in our audience. And if we're behaving differently, in a personal quasi-private situation, different than the way we are on the platform, and we're looking loving and inclusive and engaging and positive and all of that, but somebody in the audience just saw us 25 minutes ago and we were not very, we weren't fitting that, then we can be in trouble. In fact, I was speaking with a group getting ready to deliver a workshop here in Greensboro, and the workshop started at 8:30, which means I was going to be in Greensboro's version of rush hour traffic. And I'm en route, and this driver in front of me, as I was getting closer to where I was going, was very rude. Now, luckily, I was not rude. He cut me off and gave me the finger and just did all kinds. It was not pretty. I didn't do any of that in response. Now, that's partly is because it's just not my nature to do that anyway. But I was so glad I didn't, because guess what? He was in my workshop. I watched where he parked, I watched where he walked, and I came in behind him, and there he was. And you just never know. So those things that you know are your triggers, you need to work on those first, and those are not the kind of things to talk about on the platform until you have fully recuperated from being emotionally attached to it.
Wow. Wow. Being authentic. That's what I'm getting from that. Being the same person that you are on stage is behind the scenes. And I'm sure that gentleman was feeling real ooh, during that.
Well, the good news is, since I was talking about bias and unconscious bias and all that in that particular workshop, and I was giving them lots of pointers on how to identify your bias, because you can't change things until you become aware. And I was giving them all kinds of pointers on things to do. At least at the end of the workshop, if he chose to, he could think about his behavior and behave differently. Now, he never outed himself to me, but I think it was because it was so apparent. I mean, we knew, but I knew, he knew, I knew who he was.
Wow. Yeah, that's something to definitely think about is remembering, as you said, you're on basically all the time.
On all the time. And for folks that are listening that deliver programs in the area of leadership, it's important that you have had some leadership experience. Now, many speakers today don't necessarily come from the corporate environment, and so they might not have had a management position, but you really want to have some evidence to show your expertise beyond just reading books and putting some ideas together. And you really want to do that. So it made me think about it from the perspective of, these were leaders, these were managers in this particular workshop that I was delivering.